Beer is a ridiculous invention when you think about it. At some point, a human looked at a container of wet grain that had been sitting around long enough to become cloudy, bubbly, and biologically suspicious and thought, I should drink that. And somehow this was a good decision. Today, brewing involves sanitized equipment, temperature control, cultivated yeast, chemistry, and at least one guy who owns a beard for professional reasons. But the first brewers had none of that. They didn't know what yeast was. They didn't understand fermentation. They didn't even have agriculture when some of the earliest beer-like drinks may have appeared. Yet, more than 10,000 years ago, humans were already transforming wild cereals into fermented beverages. Which raises a wonderfully strange question. Did humans invent beer because they had grain? Or did they eventually grow all that grain because they really, really liked beer? Because buried in prehistoric caves is evidence that happy hour may be older than civilization itself. Before humans could invent beer, they had to invent something less glamorous. Wet carbohydrates. And that took a surprisingly long evolutionary resume. Long before anyone planted a field, hunter-gatherers were already collecting wild grasses and cereal grains. These seeds were tiny packages of stored energy, basically prehistoric protein bars designed by plants, except protected by husks, fiber, and starches that are not especially cooperative when eaten raw. So humans did what humans do best. We processed them, we cracked seeds with stones, we ground them, we mixed them with water, we heated them, we made porridges, pastes, and eventually breads. Every one of those steps made grain easier to digest, but they also created the conditions for something much more interesting. Fermentation. The key problem is that yeast does not look at a hard grain kernel and immediately see dinner. Most of the energy inside grain is stored as starch, which is made from long chains of sugar molecules. Yeast prefers simpler sugars. Fortunately, grain comes with its own biochemical locksmith. When a seed begins to germinate, enzymes activate and start breaking down stored starch so the young plant can use it for energy. Humans did not know the word enzyme, obviously. They probably had words for things like rain, fire, and stop eating my mammoth. But they could observe that soaked grain changed. It softened. It became sweeter. And if that germinated grain was crushed and mixed with warm water, even more starch could be converted into sugars. Congratulations. You now have something suspiciously close to a primitive brewing mash. The final ingredient was everywhere. Yeast. Wild yeasts live on plants, fruit skins, soil, insects, and in the surrounding environment. Humans didn't need to invent them, buy them, or start a tiny prehistoric yeast subscription service. They simply needed to create a sugary liquid and leave it exposed long enough. Then microscopic organisms would begin doing the work. Yeast consumes sugars and produces carbon dioxide and ethanol. To an ancient human, none of this would have looked like microbiology. It would have looked like a bowl of grain water mysteriously bubbling by itself, which is either a miracle or a warning. Probably both. So before beer could exist, several pieces had to come together. People gathering wild cereals, tools for grinding them, containers or stone basins for soaking them, knowledge of heat, and enough curiosity to notice that wet grain did strange things when left alone. Nobody had invented brewing yet, but they had accidentally built the laboratory. All that remained was for someone to forget about dinner. The first beer probably did not begin with a recipe. It began with neglect. Picture a small cache of grain that gets wet. Maybe rain leaks into a container. Maybe someone soaks seeds to soften them for cooking and gets distracted by the prehistoric equivalent of an emergency, which was most emergencies. The grain sits. Some of it begins to germinate. As those seeds wake up, their own enzymes start converting stored starch into simpler sugars. If the grain is then crushed, warmed, or mixed with water, the result becomes a sweet, cloudy mash. To us, that sounds like brewing chemistry. To them, it probably looked like ruined porridge. Then the microbes arrive. Wild yeast drifts in from the environment and begins consuming those sugars. Bacteria may join the party too, because early fermentation was not the clean, controlled process of a modern brewery. It was more like opening your kitchen to every microorganism in the neighborhood and hoping the polite ones showed up first. The mixture starts bubbling, the smell changes, the taste changes, and eventually so does the person drinking it. Now, we should be careful here. Archaeology cannot identify the exact afternoon when somebody first tasted accidentally fermented grain and decided to make it again. That moment left no written record, no receipt, and tragically no customer review. But accidental fermentation is not difficult to imagine because fermentation happens naturally wherever water, carbohydrates, and suitable microbes meet. Fruit can ferment on its own. Honey diluted with water can ferment. Grain mixtures can ferment. Humans did not need to understand the mechanism before learning the pattern. And pattern recognition is something our species is extremely good at. If one batch of wet grain tasted unusual and produced a pleasant effect, people could notice. If a particular preparation worked better, they could repeat it. If warming the mixture changed the result, they could remember that too. That is how many technologies begin, not with theory. With somebody noticing that last Tuesday's mistake was strangely useful. Eventually, the accident becomes intentional. Grain is deliberately soaked. Germination is stopped at the right moment. The malted grain is crushed, water is added, heat may be used. Then the mixture is allowed to ferment. No microbiology required, just observation memory and enough experimentation to survive several terrible batches. And once people learned that grain could become something more than bread or porridge, they had discovered a new kind of food, one that contained calories, flavor, social value, and a chemical reward system built directly into the human brain. At that point, forgetting the grain was no longer the mistake. The mistake was forgetting how you made it. For thousands of years, beer's origin story was basically an educated guess. Then archaeologists looked inside some holes in the floor of a cave. Raqefet Cave sits in the Mount Carmel region of modern-day Israel. Around 13,000 years ago, it was used by the Natufians, hunter-gatherers who lived in the Levant just before agriculture became firmly established there. The cave was also a burial place, and inside it were stone mortars. Not cute little kitchen mortars. Some were carved directly into the bedrock. Researchers studying several of these vessels found microscopic plant residues and patterns of starch damage that they argued were consistent with a brewing process. Their experiments suggested that the Natufians may have malted cereal grains by germinating them, crushed the resulting material, heated it with water, and then allowed the mixture to ferment. That is an extraordinary claim. Because if that interpretation is correct, these people were deliberately producing a beer, like fermented beverage, roughly 13,000 years ago, before Egyptian pyramids, before Mesopotamian cities, before writing, possibly before anyone in the region was spending their mornings complaining about farming. This was not modern beer. Do not picture a crisp golden lager appearing in a limestone pint glass. The prehistoric version was probably thicker, cloudier, and less predictable. Depending on the ingredients and fermentation, it may have resembled an alcoholic cereal porridge more than anything you would willingly order during happy hour. But the context makes the discovery even more interesting. Raqefet was a cemetery. The mortars were associated with an area used for Natufian burials, and the researchers proposed that fermented drinks may have been prepared for ritual feasts connected with the dead, which means one of our earliest pieces of evidence for brewing is not from a tavern. It is from a funeral, and strangely, that makes perfect human sense. Death creates a problem that biology cannot solve. Someone is gone, but the group remains. So people gather, they eat together, they tell stories, they perform rituals. And apparently, very early in our history, fermented grain may have joined the guest list. Archaeologists have to be cautious here. A microscopic starch grain cannot hand us a signed statement saying, yes, I was beer. The interpretation comes from multiple clues. Plant residues, altered starches, use wear on the stone tools, the archaeological context, and experiments recreating ancient processing methods. So it is better to call Raqefet some of the earliest known evidence for deliberate cereal fermentation, rather than declare that we have found the exact birthplace of beer, because somebody could have brewed earlier. Their equipment simply may not have survived. Archaeology has that frustrating habit. The first thing we find is almost never the first thing humans did. But Raqefet gives us something far more valuable than a mythical inventor. It gives us a snapshot of beer becoming social. People were no longer simply discovering that fermented grain could make them feel different. They may have been making it deliberately, gathering around it and giving it meaning. Beer had escaped the bowl. It had entered culture. And this is where beer history becomes dangerously good at starting arguments. Because once archaeologists found evidence that hunter-gatherers may have brewed fermented grain before full-scale farming, an old question became much harder to ignore. What if people did not grow grain only because they wanted bread? What if they also wanted beer? Versions of this idea have circulated for decades. The basic argument is seductive. Brewing takes a lot of grain. If fermented drinks mattered socially, ritually, or emotionally, then the desire for a reliable supply of cereals might have encouraged people to gather, protect, cultivate, and eventually domesticate them. In other words, agriculture may owe at least part of its resume to parties. Great theory. Tiny problem. We cannot prove it. The Raqefet evidence shows that some Natufian people may have been processing cereals into fermented beverages around 13,400 years ago, and the original researchers explicitly connected that activity with ritual feasting. But another archaeological study published the same year identified bread-like food remains from Shubaika 1 in Jordan dating to roughly 14,400 years ago. Hunter-gatherers were apparently making complicated cereal foods before agriculture too. So the question which came first, beer or bread, has the irritating scientific answer. It depends what evidence you mean. The oldest surviving bread-like remains are currently older than the Raqefet brewing evidence. But that does not prove bread itself was invented first. Beer leaves terrible archaeological fingerprints. Liquid disappears. Wooden containers rot. Baskets decay. Microbes eat the evidence, which feels slightly disrespectful considering they help make the drink. Even Raqefet itself is debated. The researchers interpreted residues, starch damage, tool wear, and experimental reconstruction as evidence for malting and brewing. Other archaeologists have argued that those traces do not necessarily require beer production and could potentially reflect other forms of plant processing. The original team later published a response defending its interpretation. This is what archaeology actually looks like. Not Indiana Jones pointing dramatically at a cup and announcing beer. More like 6 specialists staring at microscopic starch granules while politely disagreeing for 3 years. There is another problem with the beer-caused farming idea. Agriculture was not one decision. Across the ancient Near East, humans gradually intensified their relationships with wild plants over many generations. Climate, population, seasonal abundance, storage, social competition, risk management, food preferences, and ritual behavior may all have mattered. Beer could have been one incentive among many. And that possibility is fascinating enough. Because humans do not organize their lives around calories alone. We care about celebrations, funerals, status, hospitality, tradition, getting everyone together for something that technically could have been an email. A crop that feeds you is useful. A crop that feeds you, stores well, becomes bread, and can also produce a mind-altering drink for communal ceremonies. Now that crop has a marketing department. So beer probably did not single-handedly invent agriculture. But fermented grain may have helped make grain culturally irresistible, and once humans began producing dependable surpluses of cereals, beer was about to undergo its biggest transformation yet. It stopped being merely something people made. It became something societies were built around. Once humans built cities, beer acquired paperwork. That is how you know a hobby has become an institution. In ancient Mesopotamia, especially in the cities of Sumer, beer was no longer an occasional experiment bubbling in somebody's stone basin. It became part of ordinary economic and social life. Grain was cultivated in enormous quantities. Workers needed food and drink, temples managed resources, and brewing could operate on a scale prehistoric communities could never have imagined. Beer had entered civilization, and civilization immediately made it complicated. Mesopotamian texts refer to multiple kinds and qualities of beer, while administrative records show grain and beer moving through systems of labor and rationing. It was consumed by different levels of society rather than reserved exclusively for elites. In a world where barley was abundant and brewing transformed grain into something nutritious, flavorful, and socially useful, beer could function as food, compensation, hospitality, and ritual substance all at once. Basically, it became prehistoric liquid infrastructure. The Sumerians even had a goddess associated with brewing. Her name was Ninkasi, which feels appropriate. Once an activity becomes important enough to require divine supervision, you know humans are taking it seriously. A famous Sumerian composition known as the Hymn to Ninkasi describes stages associated with brewing. It mentions ingredients and processes including grain products and fermentation, although scholars caution against treating the text like a modern recipe where you can simply follow 12 steps and open a Bronze Age microbrewery. Ancient instructions were not written for people who needed every detail explained. They assumed you already knew what you were doing. One ingredient often discussed in connection with Mesopotamian brewing is bapir, a grain-based product sometimes translated as beer bread. Exactly how it functioned in brewing has been debated, which is another useful reminder that reconstructing ancient beer from texts is much harder than recreating grandma's lasagna. Grandma usually specified the oven temperature. The archaeological art is even better. Mesopotamian cylinder seals show people seated around large vessels, drinking through long tubes. A Sumerian seal at the Metropolitan Museum dating to roughly 2600 to 2350 BCE depicts figures sharing a drink through straws. The British Museum also preserves elaborate drinking tubes from the Royal Cemetery at Ur, including examples associated with elite burials. Yes, ancient Mesopotamians had beer straws. And no, this was probably not because they were worried about ruining their lipstick. Early beer could contain floating husks, sediment, and fermentation debris. A long straw allowed drinkers to draw liquid from below the less appealing material near the surface. So imagine several important adults gathered around one enormous jar, each holding a giant straw. Civilization had invented the communal cocktail, but sharing beer was about more than avoiding chunks of barley. Eating and drinking together creates trust. Feasts can reinforce alliances, display generosity, mark religious occasions, celebrate victories, honor the dead, and remind everyone who has enough surplus grain to provide drinks for 200 people. Beer became social technology. The person controlling grain could support brewers. The institution controlling beer could reward workers. The household offering beer could demonstrate hospitality. The temple presenting beer could transform drinking into ritual. A beverage that may once have begun as an unpredictable accident was now tied to economics, religion, labor, status, and identity. Humans had domesticated more than barley. They had domesticated fermentation. And somewhere between the prehistoric cave and the Sumerian city, beer stopped being merely something that happened to grain. It became something humans expected the world to provide. Today, beer looks very different from whatever the Natufians may have been drinking in stone mortars. It comes refrigerated, carbonated, filtered, pasteurized, packaged in cans with mountain ranges on them for reasons nobody fully understands. Modern brewers can measure temperature to a fraction of a degree, select specific yeast strains, adjust water chemistry, control bitterness, calculate alcohol content, and argue online about whether a particular beer technically qualifies as an IPA. We have come a long way, and yet the basic trick is ancient. Take grain, unlock its sugars, add water, let microorganisms transform it. The remarkable part is not simply that prehistoric humans discovered alcohol. Naturally fermented fruit existed long before our species did. Animals encounter ethanol in nature. Fermentation was never waiting for a human patent application. What humans invented was control. We noticed a natural process, remembered it, repeated it, improved it, and eventually wrapped it in ritual. Economics, religion, hospitality, and identity. That pattern extends far beyond beer. We did it with bread, cheese, yogurt, wine, pickles. For most of history, humans were collaborating with invisible organisms without knowing those organisms existed, which might be one of the strangest achievements our species ever pulled off. We domesticated microbes before we could see them, and beer became one of the places where biology and culture met particularly well, because drinking together is rarely just about the liquid. A toast at a wedding, a beer after work, a round bought for friends, a bottle opened after someone moves into a new house, these are modern behaviors built around something prehistoric humans were already discovering. Shared substances can create shared moments. The ingredients changed. The containers changed. The gods changed. The bar tab became significantly more complicated. But the social instinct underneath it is ancient. So did one brilliant prehistoric genius invent beer? Almost certainly not. Beer was probably assembled gradually from thousands of observations. Wet grain becomes sweet. Sweet mash changes when left alone. The strange liquid is worth making again. And it becomes even more valuable when everyone drinks it together. Civilization did not wake up one morning and invent happy hour. Happy hour grew slowly out of ecology, chemistry, curiosity, and human beings refusing to throw away suspicious porridge. Which brings us back to that first brave person staring into a bubbling container of fermented grain. They had no idea what yeast was, no idea what alcohol was, no idea that thousands of years later, entire industries would exist because of what was happening inside that bowl. They probably had only one question: should I drink this? Apparently, yes. And humanity has been asking for another round ever since.